What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes. In this video, we are going to be using Next.js 13 to create this application that allows us to get the current weather of a certain city or a certain place. The application is relatively simple. It allows a user to type in a certain city name, for example, Seattle. We can then get weather, which is calling the OpenWeather API, and it will show us the current Seattle weather. This project is great for beginners or anyone who's just getting started with TypeScript or Next.js 13. And to create the user interface, we are going to be using Mantine UI, which is fully supported by Next.js, and it gives you access to a bunch of React components. And for this video, we are going to be using the OpenWeather API, which allows us to get access to live data of cities across the world. Let's get into building the project. We can get started by going to an empty folder and opening up our terminal. To create our Next.js application, we can use the command npx create-next-app at latest. And to use TypeScript for our Next.js application, we can say --ts to the end of this command. It's then going to ask you to name your project. For this video, I'm just going to call it weather-app. So now our application has been fully created. We can go into our application by saying cd and then the name of our project. So in my case, weather-app. Inside of the weather app folder is our entire Next.js application. You'll see at the top we have a package.json. This means that we're able to npm install more dependencies on top of our project. For example, we want to install Mantine for all the different UI components we are going to be using throughout this tutorial. To install Mantine, we are going to npm install three different things. We can start by saying npm install, which means we want to add packages to our project. We can then say @mantine/core. This gives us access to all the core UI components. @mantine/hooks, any of the React hooks part of Mantine, and @emotion/react. Once those installs are done, we should go to our package.json and see that everything is installed right here. To get started, we can go into the pages folder in our Next application. We can then take a look at index.tsx. This is the page that is shown at the base root of our application. For example, if we were to go to localhost 3000, this is the page that would be shown to us by default. So if we go into our terminal and then npm run dev, we can see what this page currently looks like. It's going to show us the boilerplate Next.js application here. We can remove this boilerplate code and get started on our own designs. We can get started by going into the home component and deleting everything within the return statement. So let's write out some steps as to what we're going to do in this application. Firstly, we are going to design the user interface. Then we are going to call the OpenWeather API. And then we are going to show the user data based off the API result. For example, if they typed in Seattle, we would show the person the Seattle weather that comes from the OpenWeather API. So let's get started by designing the user interface. I'm going to start with a simple div on the very inside of this return statement. Within this div, I wanted to make it a background image that takes up the entire screen. So we can manually set some styles like this by saying style, two bunches of curly braces, and now we can define CSS properties for this div. I want this div to be of a static position, so it will never move, so it just stays in the background. Then I want its height to be 100 view height. That means it's going to take up 100% of the user's screen pretty much. Then we can also set the background image. For this video, I'm going to use a link to an external image. So we can say URL, which means we're telling background image we want to use an external URL. Then we can use these single quotes on the inside to start our link. I'm going to link it here, https://littlevisuals.co/images/atlantic_ridge.jpg. And we can see what this looks like right now. Pretty much this nice looking kind of landscape image, which is fitting for a weather website. Just to explain where this image is coming from, Little Visuals is a collection of a bunch of free for commercial use photographs that you can use throughout your applications. And lastly, we want to make sure that the background size of this div is cover. This means the background image isn't going to be stretching around in kind of strange ways. Let's take a look at the application so far. So as you guys can see, the background image is loaded in and it's taking up all the space of our screen, which is exactly what we wanted. You can also see as you change the size of the screen that it's not, distorting or stretching the image in any strange ways. So this is a great start. We now want to build that component that's at the center of the screen that you guys saw earlier. This is where we can start using some components provided to us by Mantine UI. At the top, we can say import, and I'm going to import the paper component from @mantine/core. Paper is very similar to a style div, and so we can use the paper components by saying paper like this. For our use case, I'm going to put a couple of different properties that are going to make the paper look special to our application. For example, we want the border around this div or around this kind of paper is one way to imagine it. And we also want padding on the inside that is of size large. So you can say p equals large. To make sure that this paper element isn't spanning across our entire screen, we can add some additional styling by saying style is equal to, and we can set the max width property equal to something smaller, like let's say 500 pixels. All right, so this is a great start, but we want this paper to be centered in the very middle of our web page. We can wrap a div around the paper that is going to do that centering. So let's do that now. We can go in here and say div, and make sure it goes all the way around the paper element as well. This div is going to have certain stylings. It's going to help kind of center everything to the middle of the screen that is inside of it. Because we always want this paper element to be in the middle of the screen, we can use a position of absolute. We can then say, go from the left 50%, go from the top 50%. So we're kind of indenting in 50% from the left inwards and the top kind of downwards is the way to think about it. Then you want to perform a transform, which is going to pretty much shift this div into where it should kind of belong. And so we can say translate is of -50% and -50%. I would say for this video, don't be too concerned about the actual, workings as to what's happening in this div. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen is it's going to take everything within the inside of it and put it in the middle of the screen, both vertically and horizontally. So let's go take a look at our application. And you guys can see we now have this block that's in the middle of our screen, which is exactly what we want. And once we put things in like text, for example, it's going to fill up. This is just the default width and height that the paper has when it's inside of a div. So let's get started by adding some text on top of our little block that we created here. I'm going to go to the top again, and I'm going to import a bunch of different things from Mantine core. For example, I'm going to import the text input, the button, just the text element in general, and then also the group. I'll explain these as we use them. Groups in Mantine are very nice because they allow us to put different types of content in kind of separated containers. So everything that you want to be separated is separated. A great example is we can have a group at the top, and within this group, we can have a text element. For example, get the weather. So whenever you're working with a React component library like Mantine, understand that you can add properties to these components to kind of change up their functionality. For example, group has a position property, which allows you to define the justify content property, but pretty much just means if you want things in your group to be to the left or right or center or apart, you can choose here. We can see what text apart looks like for this group. The text also has properties. For example, size is equal to extra large, and we can also define the weight of the text so you can imagine how bold it is. I'm going to say 500. Let's go look at our application. All right, so our text looks pretty good. We can copy this group here and make another group on the bottom. For this one, I want the position to still be apart, and I want the size to be equal to large instead of extra large, and I want to get rid of the weight property. So I'm going to say enter a city and get the weather below. So kind of telling the user what our application is doing. All right, so it's still looking good. Now I'm going to create a group that is going to hold our text input for the user to type in. So we can copy one of these groups, bring it down, and instead of the text element on the inside, we can make a text input element. So text input and just close it right away like this. I want the label of the text input to show city name. So label is a little text that will show up on top of the input, so we can show the user again what they should input. And then placeholder is that little grayed out text you see inside of the input. For example, I'm going to show the user an example city. I'll say San Diego. Let's go see what this looks like. All right, looks great. The user is able to type in, as we can see here. And so now all we need now is a button for the user to press. So I'm going to make another group. And instead, within this group, I want to show a button. Within the button, it's just going to be simple, get weather. Inside of Mantine, buttons have the property of variant and allows you to kind of show a different type of button. For example, if we use the variant to gradient, it's going to give us kind of a cool gradient background. And I want the size of this button to be equal to medium. All right, looks good. As you guys can see, the city input and the button are really close together. We can go to a group, for example, the group that our input's contained in, and we can tell that group, the margin bottom of this group can be of a certain kind of value. For example, we can see what extra small looks like. Let's go see what that change did. And as you guys see, and as you guys can see, it gave us a little bit of space in between the two groups. So we have one group, which is this input group here, and the button on the bottom here. And so there's a margin on the bottom of the input that's giving some space. So this is great. We now have defined all the main UI components of this Next.js project. An important thing to think about is right now, when the user types in data, we're not really saving that data anywhere. So let's think about that. To save the text input data, we can use something in React called a state or a use state. This will allow us to save this text input within a variable that we can use wherever we want within our application. We can get started with states by going to the top of our page here and importing, with curly braces, use state from React. We can then go to the top of our home component and define the state by saying use state with an empty string. Use state itself is a function that's going to return us some constants that we can use. For example, the actual value of the state, the city input, and then a function that we can use to set the state, set city input. And so if we want to change this state equal to whatever the user typed in, for example, Seattle, we want to call this set city input whenever our text input changes. So we can go down to our text input, and text input gives us access to something called onChange. And we can set a property within our text input called onChange, which is an event that's going to get fired whenever the user inputs a character or even deletes something, for example. Within the onChange, we can get the event of the change, and we can set it equal to some JavaScript logic. So the event of the change gives us access to a bunch of different things, but it mainly says, at this event, we are at this text input. That's important because when we say set city input, what we can do is we can say event.target. So where is the event coming from? Well, it's coming from this text input. And because we know the event's coming from here, it's always going to come from this text input. And so we can go to this target, which is the text input, and get the value of it by saying .value. So if I were to type in the character C, for example, it would go into here and set city input to whatever I have inputted. So C, for example. So now we can expect that whenever we change our text input, for example, we type in a word, our city input in our state is always going to be equal to this value. So now that we have this code set up, we can assume that our city input is always going to be equal to the value of whatever our text input is. And we can see in real time if this is actually working by console.logging at the top the city input. So let's go to our application and type in some stuff and see what the city input's giving us. All right, so if I type in San Diego, you guys will see it's being updated to San Diego. I can type in New York City, and even if I want to like delete characters, for example, it's still going to update that state because whenever we change a character, that onChange event is getting fired. Amazing. So we have one final step we can get into before we try and call the API, which is having this button actually point to a function. Right now, you can just click on it and it looks nice, but it doesn't do anything. And this is relatively simple. We can go down to our button here, and we can define it to call a function on the onClick event. So whenever we click the button, we can use an arrow function like this, which we can point it to call a function, for example, get weather data. This is a function we have to go define. And we can define that by scrolling up, going up here and saying function get weather data. And this is actually going to be an asynchronous function because to call our API, we are going to use a keyword called await. But for now, we can just have this console.log button pressed to show you guys how this logic is working. So let's go over to our application and you'll see the button will get pressed whenever we press it like this. This might seem super simple, but it's actually incredibly important. You could imagine that when we actually press this button, the only logic happening right now is we're logging to our console, which is pretty simple. But we're soon going to change to where instead, when we press this button, it's going to call our API, get the data, and show it to the user. So having this function exist in our code actually helps us out because now we know that if we want to call the API, we can do it right here at line 18. Now we can go get set up with the OpenWeather API. So go on over to openweathermap.org. You're then going to want to go to the top right and create an account. It's 100% free. Once your account has been created, you're going to want to go to the top right and click on your account name here, and then go to My API Keys. You should have a default API key right here. So copy this key here, and then go over to your application. And then at the top, I'm going to save it in a constant by saying const API underscore key is equal to that string. This API key is necessary because in order to call the API, it has to know it's coming from an actual validated source. For example, the account you created. For this video, we are going to use this API request right here, which allows us to query the weather based on a certain city name. The documentation here gives us access to exactly how it wants us to structure it. So I'm going to copy this link here and bring it over to our function. So the process is going to look like this. Query data, which I'm going to talk about. If there is an error, throw error. If not, save data and show. If not, save data. In order to get ready for this save data step, I'm actually going to make a state above that's just going to be an empty object. It's going to say const weather data and then set weather data. It's going to be equal to a use state of an empty object. Because we're using TypeScript, when you say use state of empty object, it's going to assume that the type is an empty object. And so if we do anything like, have an object with like a, property that says city is equal to Seattle, for example, it's not going to allow us to access this city property, and it's going to throw us an error because this city property is not in the type of an empty object. We can get around this by using a use state with the typing of any. This means that this state can technically be any value, but it allows us to get away from these typing issues over here. If you're consistently calling a certain API in your Next.js applications and you know that this is going to be used a lot of times, you can actually make a type that is exactly what you would expect from all the different data from a certain API, for example. This is just a beginner tutorial, so I thought I'd talk about that, but we're just going to use any, which means it's way kind of more bare bones in terms of what the state allows us to use. All right, so let's get started with querying our data. I'm going to make a try and catch statement. This way we can throw errors, and just in case we get an error from our API, we can console.log that error to see what happened. We can define the const server response equal to a fetch statement that we are just going to say await and then fetch. So pretty much wait for this fetch to get our data. We can make the initial part of the fetch equal to the initial part of this string here. And then just like they did, we want to have a bunch of different parameters on top. I'm going to add a question mark to the end of this URL. And then just to structure it nicely, I'm going to show all the different parameters we're adding on top in just a bunch of different lines. For example, we are going to add Q is equal to. So Q is used a lot when you're communicating with APIs to say kind of like the main thing you're querying for example, the city name. And we can add our city input string that is saved in our state above here. So whatever the user inputted. And we also want to say, and the app ID is equal to. This app ID is our API key, which we saved in the const line 8. So we can bring this down to right here. Something that you don't note in this call right here is we also need the units. And I want Fahrenheit, so I'm going to say and units is equal to imperial. This means we are querying this API route with 3 different variables. The query variable equal to our city, the app ID variable equal to our API key, and then the units variable equal to imperial. And so once this open server response should be spelled like this. And so once this server response is done, we can kind of wait for the response by saying const data is equal to server response. And so for example, when it's done, we can translate server response into a .json format. We also want to make an await here as well. At this point, we have access to the data, so we can say console.log data. The data being returned from our server is going to be a JSON block, so it's gonna, look like an object in JavaScript. If the server throws us a 400, aka it didn't really find any data for us, we can say if data underscore cod or .cod, and they don't say code, it is cod, so it's not a mistake, I don't know why, is equal to 400. We can then throw the data as the error object here because this is going to be an error object. But if it's not 400, that generally means we had a successful response. And so what we can do is we can set the weather data equal to data like this. So it's saying set our weather data state, which is an object, equal to the object of data we received from our server. So let's go to our application and see this in practice. Make sure to refresh your application. I'm going to type in San Diego. Then I'm going to press get weather. As you guys can see, we got a massive amount of data coming from the server over at OpenWeather API. We get access to a bunch of different data surrounding what the weather API gave us. For example, we got the temperature, we even got like the humidity, what the temperature feels like. We have the name of where the query went to. We have the weather object here, so we can see that there are broken clouds here. And so now that we have access to all this data and it's saved in a state, we can show this data to the user. One way to show the data to our user is we can say object.keys. So how many keys does weather data have? And this keys is going to be an array. So we can look at the length of all the different keys. And as long as that's not equal to 0, we can assume that we successfully got the weather data we're expecting. Because remember, initially, this is going to have a length of 0. So I'm going to say question mark to show the content here. And then we need a colon to show null. So this is a ternary statement here and relatively simple. If this becomes true, then show this data here. But if this is false, show null. And so let's take a group from up here, paste it in, and I'm going to position these groups to the left, and I instead just want a simple text element here. And we can use the data in the object to say something like weather data dot name. And so this is going to say like San Diego. And so I'm going to say San Diego or Seattle or whatever, weather. And so this is a way of just showing some data from our request to the user. I'm going to copy this group again, and this text is going to instead say it's currently weather data dot main dot temp. Because if we go to our application, we'll see that inside this object, we have access to the weather data, which is this object. And then we can go to dot main, and we can see the temperature is in the dot temp property here. So the user will see 62.33. We can also add a degree by saying ampersand deg colon. I believe that's called like an HTML attribute or something. But this is just like weird stuff like colons and like emojis and stuff like that can be written in this format. And then an F for the Fahrenheit. And just to show you guys, right now we can go into here and say San Diego, get the weather, and it's going to show us in the San Diego weather, it's currently 62 degrees, which is pretty cool. I want to make this currently here a little bit larger, so I'm going to go add that. We can go into the text around the currently and say size is equal to large, and then make its weight equal to 500. So that's how bold it is. And so you guys can see it's working for showing this data. An interesting thing I want to show you guys is we can also use the icons provided by the OpenWeather API. So we can use some external images provided to us by the OpenWeather API here. This link is going to take us to this little icon here. And if we go to localhost 3000, we can see within this object, we can go to the .weather and then 0, and you'll see that there's an icon ID right here that we can use. So we can make an image inside of our application to show this icon that comes from the OpenWeather API. I'm going to put this in the same group as the text on the bottom here, and I'm going to say image like this. The source of the image is going to be equal to http://openweathermap.org/image/wn/ I know a lot of stuff here. Then we can add that icon from our data. Weather data dot weather of 0 dot icon. Oh, and these have to be in curly braces because we're using the JavaScript inside of here. And we can also show the different quality icons. So in this example, I'm going to say at 4x.png. And that's the full link we need to define the source of the image. I'm also going to set the width equal to 100 pixels and the height equal to 100 pixels. And as you guys can see, we are getting access to this icon right here. So I can go in, type in a city. I'll use something else like Miami, for example, and we're able to see what the weather's like over in Miami. All right, so that's the full video. Hopefully this has been a great introduction to working with Next.js and also working with external API data.